Hi, this is George LeMieux. I have the privilege of contributing to the Palm Beach Atlantic University through the LeMieux Center for Public Policy, and welcome again to one of our great interviews with one of our speakers of importance here in our country. We are so pleased to welcome Anita McBride to Palm Beach Atlantic University. She is a veteran of the White House, and she is an author of a wonderful book, Remember the First Ladies, which not only talks in a little part about her time in the White House, but is a chronicle of the First Ladies all the way back from Martha Washington all the way to our current First Lady, Dr. Biden. So thank you, Anita, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
What an interesting topic, and I think one that hasn't been explored. And I was so fascinated to read your book and see the importance that these First Ladies have had on the influence of the country, all the way from kind of being the president when President Wilson was ill and his wife kind of took over for 18 months, to Martha Washington, who set the precedent, to our current and recent First Ladies who were really impactful. So tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this and your time working in the White House.
Well, thank you so much for reading the book. You've done a terrific summary of what we've tried to capture in, 246 years plus of history. Our view, and I have co-authors, there's three of us, our view is that if we talk about inclusive history in our country, we have to include the stories of these women from the beginning, from Martha Washington to today, the numbers of contributions that they've made in our politics, in our policy, in our global diplomacy, how they've been a partner to the presidency, how they have managed to deal with limitations of women at the time that many of them, of course, in the early years of our country weren't even included in the Constitution, but how they were still able to make a contribution. And then, of course, as their growing visibility on the public stage, and then really having platforms of their own. So we trace all of that throughout our entire country's history.
And you had a front row seat to this, right?
I
Working
did.
in the White House. So tell us a little bit about that.
I did, and I think that obviously was the greatest inspiration for me on why this topic is important to tell these stories. I had a front row seat to history, not once, but 3 times, working in the White House and seeing different First Ladies, from Nancy Reagan and Barbara Bush and Laura Bush, and particularly with Laura Bush. She traveled the world. She went to 77 countries, all 50 states. I went to 67 of those countries with her, and the majority of those states. The contributions that she made, the issues that she tried to elevate on the national and global stage. And yet it's also a position that requires a very important element, dating back to Martha Washington, is the social element, the ceremonial piece. That is a really important part of the role, and not to be diminished. How you welcome visitors from around the world and Americans to the White House, which is the most important global stage of all, was something I really saw the significance as well.
Well, it's such a great read, and what I learned in the book that I didn't know and I didn't really think about is that when Washington was elected, they had all these British traditions, and they were trying to come to grips as to which ones they would embrace and which ones they wouldn't. But that our president is not just the chief magistrate, he's also the head of state.
That's right.
So the president's wife becomes that role as well. And you talked about Martha Washington having these teas and how,
salons.
And how the president would kind of step back and let her run it. And she, of course, was from high society, and he wasn't.
Right.
And you also chronicle about this. I think this is a really important point in this book, is a lot of the men that we know who are president would not be president but for their wives. And without her station and the ability to have all these visitors come to Mount Vernon,
absolutely,
he never would have been president, right? He never would have been probably in charge of the military in the Revolutionary War. So she was a real partner for him.
And he knew it from the beginning. The minute that he was elected president, of course, she wasn't even there. Our first capital was in New York. She's still in Mount Vernon. It's 6 weeks before she gets up to New York. The inauguration had already happened. But when the new president now of a new nation, receives her on the shores of New Jersey, where she arrived by boat from Mount Vernon, what he assembled for her was to be received with great fanfare. to send the message right away to everyone, including his own advisors. She was an important part, an integral part of the presidency, and he knew he needed her. She did have the background, as you say, coming from the Southern gentility, having hosted people at Mount Vernon, having really been raised that way. She was a premier social hostess, and it helped him. Now, his advisors handed her right away a list of things she needed to do and people she needed to host. But the one thing that they told her, she could not accept invitations to other people's homes. Again, not to show favoritism to one over another. We were still dealing with a fractious nation, and so she had to be very careful. So she had to establish precedent, as you say, and balance the formality of what is expected on the world stage with then a very democratic view of how you welcome the average citizen, which is now what the government was founded for, to support the average citizen. And it was their government.
You talked about it in the beginning until maybe all the way to the Civil War, maybe later. They had these January 1st or New Year's Eve. They would let everybody come in.
January 1st, New Year's Day.
People could come into the people's house.
That's right.
To think about that today, it's pretty extraordinary. But fast forwarding, you and your co-authors really, I think, what struck me is Eleanor Roosevelt and the role in how she kind of also remade the office and made it much more of an office of the First Lady with policy, and then the role she even played after when Harry Truman gave her an important role at the United Nations. Talk about that a little bit.
Exactly. Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the three First Ladies in the book that gets their own individual chapter, and she really established the activist model. She, too, had been very involved in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's campaigns for governor and his public life. When she came to Washington as First Lady, she worried about it. She thought that she would now be stifled in the things that she was already doing. She had a weekly column, she had a radio show, she was a paid public speaker, she was doing quite well. And Franklin Roosevelt did not want her to have a public role. It was very difficult for her to establish her place, and how she did it was what she was most comfortable with, her extraordinary communication skills. I mean, she has established a forum for female members of the press corps because they were really locked out of the president's
and she had press conferences.
And she had press conference all the time. She had a weekly radio show on Sunday nights from the map room at the White House, actually on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The first voice Americans heard was hers that night in the radio broadcast. The president, of course, gave his famous Day of Infamy speech at the Congress the next day. So that shows you, I mean, the level of authority that she used and utilized. I mean, she was very active. Of course, no other First Ladies had this amount of time to be a First Lady either. Right? It was 12 years. And when she did leave the White House, of course, after Franklin Roosevelt died, you're right, President Truman handed her a very important role as leading the human rights delegation and the new UN, and really helping to write the UN Charter on Human Rights. In two speeches that she gave in Paris for the Human Rights Commission are considered two of the top 100 rhetorical speeches of the 20th century.
It's pretty impressive.
It's very impressive, and two other First Ladies have that distinction. Hillary Clinton in 1995 at the Beijing Women's Conference, but the one that surprises everybody the most is Barbara Bush and her speech, the commencement address at Wellesley in 1990, how she turned around completely negative situation. The students did not want her and felt she attained her notoriety and her status in life through her husband, completely dismissing all the things that she had done. But she did the speech anyway, had them eating out of her hands at the end.
Yeah, not smart to underestimate Barbara Bush. Right?
Never underestimate Barbara Bush.
And then it's the modern times, you think about Jacqueline Kennedy and how she cemented that Camelot image plus her foreign language skills. I remember there's that famous line, I'm going to paraphrase it, that she was such a big hit in Paris that
Right.
President Kennedy said he escorted Mrs. Kennedy to Paris.
Yes, I'm the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to
Right.
Paris.
Right. So,
That's right.
But then when you get into the Hillary Clinton era, you start to see first ladies even become more active and have this office, this position, this bully pulpit to be able to further causes. And that's really the modern era that we're in now. So how is that different from before?
Well, and you know, to be fair, too, for some of Mrs. Clinton's predecessors, Betty Ford was an activist model as well, pushing for the ERA when her husband's advisors did not want her to push for the ERA. Rosalind Carter as well. We have Rosalind Carter to thank for establishing the actual structure for a First Lady's office, which is so interesting about that. The president handed her an initiative, handed her a mental health commission to run, for which she was honorary chair. So she needed to expand her staff. The problem was the president campaigned on reducing the size of the White House staff. So this probably was the one issue where the Carters fought the most, was over that. But she succeeded. She expanded the office, hired a policy director for the first time. There was a projects director in a First Lady's office, and it's grown since. And then, but obviously, the generational shift in 1992 with Hillary Clinton coming in after you really had succeeded all these World War II wives. You know, she was an activist, a model, having come in, having been a lawyer, private in a private firm, having really championed a number of social causes through different foundations that she was a part of. She too did not want to be tempered. The president handed her an initiative, handed her health care reform to do. She was perfectly qualified from the policy standpoint. But the way that it was unveiled, or the way that it was handled in a not very transparent way, it just blew up, and it failed. And she made a pivot into a completely different area, into global women's empowerment after the healthcare debacle, frankly.
But kind of pushed the office, right? Even though she wasn't successful on the healthcare piece, she stretched.
She did stretch the office.
And that made the office more powerful.
Well, she also had an office in the West Wing. This was the first lady who had an office in the West Wing. Rosalind Carter was the first to have an office in the East Wing. First ladies worked out of the residence, out of their dressing rooms before that. But Mrs. Clinton had an office in the West Wing to work on health care reform. She never did use it again after health care reform went away. But she also had an office in the East Wing. She had an office in the old executive office building for the women's empowerment issues that she worked on. She had an office in Jackson Place by Lafayette Park, which was running her Millennium Council, all of her preservation, Save America's Treasures projects. So her reach was far and wide. And then, of course, she remains the only First Lady in our history that ran for elective office, won
right.
2 terms as senator, ran for the nomination of her party, failed once, but got it another time, and then became Secretary of State. It's really an extraordinary career, an extraordinary public
You think
platform.
there's a little Abigail Adams and a little Eleanor Roosevelt?
I think Abigail Adams would have loved to have had these opportunities available for her because, of course, she too was an activist First Lady, the greatest confidant to her husband, very, very astute, really cared about the formation of this new nation, completely dedicated to it, sacrificed a great deal for it, long separations from her husband, a witness to our revolution, an incredible First Lady.
I love what you wrote, that she was sending letters out to her friends saying you might want to send these to the newspapers so that she could advance her causes
and her husband's causes.
So,
That's right.
Anita, these are just fantastic stories, and
thank
I don't
you.
think you can really understand the presidency without understanding the First Ladies.
You're right.
Thank you for this great book.
Thank you for
coming
inviting me to talk
Palm
about
Beach
it.
Atlantic. And everyone should go out and buy this book. It's a brand new
Yes,
book.
please do. And do a review if you like
Remember the First Ladies by Anita McBride and 2 other great ladies. So we're so thrilled you're here. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it.